15 seconds earlier, the judge opened my envelope, and the entire courtroom froze. My in-laws smirked at me like they already owned the verdict. But the moment his eyes hit the first page, I saw something break in their confidence. It was the first time in years I felt the ground shift back under my feet. I had walked into the King County Courthouse that morning, feeling like a man being marched into an execution. The rain outside Seattle came down in thick sheets, and the sound of it followed me through the metal detectors. I took a seat at the petitioner table, the cheap wooden chair wobbling just enough to remind me how alone I was. No lawyer at my side yet. No family with me. Just the envelope I had been guarding for weeks. The Harrington family arrived behind me in a wave of expensive perfume and polished shoes. Ronald led them in. Shoulders squared, eyes scanning the room like he owned it. Margaret trailed slightly behind. Her chin lifted in a way that warned everyone else to stay out of her way. Julia walked in last. Calm and confident in a tailored navy dress that probably cost more than my first car. She did not look at me. She did not need to. Her confidence said everything. Caleb smirked at me when he passed. It was the same smirk he had used the day he told me I was lucky they allowed me into the family at all. I let my eyes settle on the envelope in my hand instead. Focus. Breathe. Stay steady. That was what Brent had told me. He was not seated beside me yet because he was still in another courtroom for a morning hearing. I knew he would rush in at any moment. But for now, it was just me and the storm I had been preparing to unleash. The judge entered and called the room to order. He asked each side to present their initial statements. The Harrington lawyer launched into a polished speech about marital breakdown, financial irresponsibility on my part, and the very real concerns about my ability to provide a stable environment for my daughter Lily. I watched Julia keep her expression calm as he described me as a man with inconsistent income and unstable living circumstances. He spoke as if he was reading from a script the family had rehearsed for months. I kept quiet. I listened. I let the words land without reacting. Every accusation was a brick being stacked on the pile of humiliation they had been building for years. I waited for the moment I could tip it over. The judge shifted his attention to me. He asked if I had anything to submit before he reviewed the prenup and financial statements provided by the Harringtons. My heart pounded through my shirt. The envelope felt warm in my hand from how tightly I had been gripping it. I stood and approached the bench. The courtroom felt like it had shrunk to a narrow tunnel. I placed the envelope in front of the judge. My voice stayed steady as I told him I had prepared additional documentation relevant to the case. I stepped back. My palms were sweating, but my expression stayed blank. I had practiced that look in the mirror for days. The judge opened the envelope. For a moment, there was only silence. Rain pattered against the tall courthouse windows. A chair creaked somewhere behind me. I focused on the judge's eyes as they scanned the first page. His brows lifted. He blinked slowly. Then he flipped to the next page. And the next? Ronald straightened in his chair. Margaret leaned forward with the faintest twitch of unease. Julia finally looked at me with a flicker of confusion. The judge exhaled one sharp breath that sounded almost like a laugh. He shook his head slightly, as if he could not believe what he was reading. Then he set the pages down and looked directly at the Harrington lawyer. He told him that the court would need to pause before moving forward. He needed to review the documents thoroughly because they changed several fundamental assumptions made by the responding party. The room shifted. The power balance cracked. The Harrington lawyer stammered something about wanting to verify the authenticity of the documents, and the judge cut him off with a firm wave of his hand. He said he would decide that after reviewing everything himself. I did not smile. I did not need to. I could feel the tension tightening behind me. I could feel the way Caleb leaned forward with sudden alertness. I could feel the disbelief radiating off Ronald, as if the universe had betrayed him. And Julia kept staring at me like she was trying to understand when exactly she had lost control. The judge called for a 5-minute recess. He walked out with the envelope in hand. The bailiff announced the break, and people in the gallery whispered among themselves. I stayed seated. I breathed slowly. My pulse still hammered in my ears. But something inside me had settled. This was the moment I had been building toward, ever since the night I realized the life I had been living was built on lies. This was the moment I had feared and rehearsed and dreamed about. The moment they finally saw who they were dealing with. Across the aisle, Julia stood and walked toward her parents. I could not hear what she said. But I saw her expression crack for the first time. Margaret grabbed her arm. Ronald shook his head in disgust at the stack of papers the judge had taken with him. Caleb murmured something under his breath, and Julia snapped at him. Their perfect unity crumbled one fracture at a time. I looked down at my hands. They were still shaking slightly. But now it felt like the tremor that follows an explosion rather than the one that comes before. Everything I had endured. Every humiliation. Every quiet night alone wondering how to protect Lily. Every moment I felt powerless. Had led here. The envelope was just the beginning. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the hum of voices around me, and waited for the judge to return. The judge returned far sooner than I expected. The envelope no longer in his hand, but tucked under his arm, as if he already knew what he would say. I straightened my back and forced my breathing into something steady. Whatever happened next, there was no turning back. He took his seat and signaled the bailiff to call the courtroom to order. The chatter faded into a low hum, and then disappeared completely. I kept my eyes on the judge, but I could feel the Harringtons staring daggers into the side of my face. The judge cleared his throat and spoke in a calm voice that carried across the room. He said he had reviewed the documents I submitted and confirmed that they were relevant to the financial claims being made. Then he instructed both legal teams to prepare for a deeper evaluation of the evidence before the next phase of the hearing. The Harrington lawyer stood up so quickly his chair scraped across the floor. He demanded an explanation, arguing that the material should have been shared earlier and that the recess was too short for proper review. The judge simply told him that the burden was on his team to address any inconsistencies in their own claims. Not on mine, to protect their assumptions. I could almost hear Ronald grinding his teeth behind me. The judge then asked if my attorney was present. That was when the side door opened and Brent finally walked in. His tie was crooked from rushing, and his briefcase was still unzipped. But the man moved with the confidence of someone who had dealt with high-pressure courtrooms for 2 decades. He gave me a quick nod before approaching the bench to announce his appearance. Once he took the seat next to me. He whispered that he had gotten a text about the recess but had not known what I submitted. I told him quietly that the documents were everything we had prepared together and a little more. He looked at me with a puzzled frown but did not ask questions. He trusted me more than most people ever had. The judge directed both sides to prepare for preliminary questioning. Brent opened his file, adjusted his glasses, and began flipping through what I had provided. He paused at page 3, blinked hard, then looked up at me with a stunned expression. He whispered, asking if the numbers were correct. I nodded once. He whispered again, asking when exactly I had finalized the transaction. I told him 2 months ago. His brows shot up, but he composed himself and sat straighter. His voice low and steady as he prepared for the questioning. The Harrington lawyer was called first. He opened with a direct attack, questioning my financial stability and my living situation. He pointed out the apartment I had been renting and the irregular pay periods during the years I helped develop my startup. He listed every financial misstep I had made in the past decade, as if reciting a criminal record. I answered calmly. Yes. The startup had taken years of personal investment. Yes. There were months I lived off savings. Yes. I had moved into a small apartment when Julia and I separated. My voice stayed level and quiet. Brent, let me speak for myself. Watching the Harringtons, out of the corner of his eye. The lawyer then pressed harder, implying that my financial choices made me unfit for primary custody of Lily. He painted a picture of instability while glancing at the judge as if expecting approval. Then he made a mistake. He said confidently that my income last year was minimal, and that my net worth was negligible. Brent stood up with the smoothness of someone who had been waiting for that exact moment. He asked permission to introduce clarification based on the new documents. The judge granted it. Brent handed the judge a single-page summary pulled from the envelope. The judge looked it over, nodded, and instructed Brent to proceed. Brent then turned to the Harrington lawyer and asked him politely if he still maintained his claim about my financial state. The lawyer straightened his papers defensively and said yes, based on the information previously available. Brent held up the page like a casual reminder. He explained that my startup had been acquired earlier that year by a tech conglomerate headquartered in Denver. He read the valuation and the percentage of equity I had held. A quiet gasp rippled through the gallery. I saw Ronald clutch the edge of his seat. I saw Margaret's eyes narrow as she calculated every implication. I saw Julia freeze completely, like her mind refused to process what she had just heard. Brent continued calmly. He read the exact payout amount. Then he listed my current assets. The condo I had purchased in South Lake Union. The liquid accounts. The trust I had set up for Lily. Every number fell into the air like a hammer strike. The Harrington lawyer tried to speak, but his voice cracked. The judge asked him to take a seat. For the first time in 2 years, I felt something close to vindication. Not revenge. Not triumph. Just the simple relief of truth finally entering a room that had been full of lies for too long. But nothing prepared me for what happened next. The judge asked Julia to stand. She did. But her eyes stayed fixed on the carpet. He asked her if she had disclosed all relevant financial information during discovery. She said yes. Her voice was steady and rehearsed. Then the judge asked her if she was aware of any financial claims her parents had made on her behalf that were inaccurate. She said no. Brent leaned toward me and whispered that the judge was already doubting their entire narrative. I watched as the Harrington lawyer shuffled his papers, looking more rattled by the minute. Then the judge asked me a question. He wanted to know when I first realized that the financial narrative presented by the Harringtons did not match reality. I told him the truth. I said I had suspected something long before the divorce filing because the family had treated me like a financial burden even when they had no insight into my actual work or income. I explained that Julia had distanced herself from everything involving my startup years earlier and had shown no interest in what happened with it. The judge nodded slowly. Then he called for another short recess. This time the tension in the room was suffocating. As soon as he left, Ronald shot up from his chair and pointed at me, whispering in a harsh voice that echoed even without volume. I ignored him. Brent stepped in front of me as a subtle shield. Margaret grabbed Ronald's arm, trying to calm him. Julia looked torn between anger and fear, her hands shaking slightly as she gathered her notes. Caleb stared at me with a hollow expression. Not anger. Not shock. Something closer to fear. I had seen that look before. The day I confronted him at the Harrington house about the accusation he had made to Julia behind my back. Back then, he had looked at me the same way a man looks at a fuse he thought he cut, only to realize it was still burning. Brent asked me quietly if there was more the judge needed to see later. I told him yes. A lot more. His eyes narrowed with concern, but he did not question me. The bailiff called everyone to their seats. I took a breath and prepared myself. The next phase would be harder. Financial truth was only the first blow. The second blow was something the Harringtons never expected anyone to uncover. When the judge came back in, his expression looked sharper, more focused. He adjusted his glasses and signaled for both legal teams to stand by. Then he turned toward me and said he had one more question before proceeding. Something that had been bothering him since he reviewed the documents. He asked what made me decide to bring this evidence now, instead of during settlement talks. I hesitated for a moment, not because I did not know the answer, but because saying it out loud felt like stepping across a line I had been holding for months. I looked at the Harringtons, then at Brent, then back at the judge. I said it was because for years I had been made to feel small, manipulated, pushed into corners where I had no voice. I said I wanted the truth to come out in a place where no one could twist it. The judge nodded slowly and said we would move forward. I braced myself, knowing the next question he asked might pull the lid off everything I had been holding back. The judge leaned back slightly, waiting for my answer to settle in the air. And for a moment the entire courtroom felt frozen. I kept my eyes on him until he shifted his attention to the Harrington lawyer and instructed him to prepare for the next round of questioning. The bailiff stepped closer to the bench, and the judge quietly flipped through the documents again, as if something inside them was still bothering him. Brent nudged my arm gently and whispered that the judge was circling something. He said I needed to stay steady because the next phase might get personal. I nodded and tried to relax my shoulders. But the muscles in my back were already tightening again. I knew what was coming. The judge was not only questioning financial truth, he was about to probe everything else that had gone wrong in my marriage. When he finally lifted his gaze, he called Julia to the stand. She hesitated, eyes darting once toward her father, as if asking for instructions. Ronald stiffened, but did not signal anything. For the first time, she walked up alone, without her parents leading or shielding her. She sat down slowly, clasped her hands, and stared at the judge as if afraid of what he would ask next. He began gently, asking her to confirm the timeline of our separation and the reasons she had cited in the divorce filing. She repeated what she had told everyone earlier, that we had grown apart, that my work kept me distant, that she felt unsupported. Her voice sounded rehearsed, stripped of any warmth we once shared. Then the judge asked her whether she had ever felt pressured by her family to file for divorce. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. She blinked several times and then finally shook her head. The judge watched her closely, then shifted the questioning to earlier incidents involving tension between me and the Harringtons. He asked if those tensions had influenced her decision. She said they might have. Her voice wavered for the first time, a small crack in her composure. Brent leaned closer and whispered that the judge was setting up the foundation. He said he wanted to know whether the hostility from her family had been planted long before the divorce. He reminded me with a quick glance that if the judge opened that door, the Harringtons might not be ready for what was on the other side. The judge then allowed my attorney to question her. Brent stood and approached with a calm stride. He did not start with accusations or dramatic claims. Instead, he asked simple questions about our relationship in the months leading up to the separation. How often I was home, how I cared for Lily, how often she worked late. She answered each question, sometimes defensively, sometimes evasively. But she answered. Then he asked her whether she believed I was an involved father. She paused again, then admitted yes, that I was always present for our daughter, no matter what was happening between us. That small admission tightened something in my chest. Not triumph, not relief, something heavier. She still remembered that, even after everything. Brent stepped back and said he had no further questions for her. The Harrington lawyer looked rattled, not sure whether to salvage her testimony or leave it alone. He stood, stammered through a few weak clarifications, then gave up quickly. When the judge dismissed her, she walked back to her seat with her eyes cast down, avoiding mine completely, before the judge could move on. The Harrington lawyer stood again and requested the court address concerns about the validity of my financial evidence. He argued that the acquisition paperwork was too recent, that it should require independent verification, that my sudden wealth might not reflect long-term stability. Brent countered calmly, pointing out that the acquisition had already been publicly reported. He handed a printout of the article from a Seattle business journal. The judge reviewed it briefly and nodded. The Harrington lawyer flinched slightly but did not argue further. The tension thickened as the judge prepared to shift topics. He folded his hands, looked directly at me, and said he had one more question before proceeding. He wanted to know if there were any additional circumstances related to my marriage or the separation that I believed were relevant to the case. His gaze was sharp, more pointed than before. I felt my heartbeat quicken. Brent turned toward me slowly, his eyes narrowing as if asking silently whether I was ready to say what we had kept hidden until now. There were things he knew, and things he did not. Things I had buried deeper than the financial truth. I glanced at Julia. She sat stiffly between her parents. Her hands clasped so tightly, her knuckles were white. She stared straight ahead, refusing to look at me. Ronald glared at me with open hostility. Gripping the edge of his chair, Margaret folded her arms and tilted her chin slightly, waiting like a spectator confident her side would win. And Caleb, he sat behind his parents, his jaw locked, his eyes fixed on me in a way that reminded me of that night in their house. The night he said something that almost destroyed my marriage. His look now was the same as it was back then. A man terrified that I might open a door he had tried to bolt shut. The judge waited patiently. His tone remained calm. But there was no mistaking the weight behind his question. He was giving me an opening. Whether I stepped through it was up to me. I cleared my throat, trying to steady my voice. I said there were things that had never been addressed because I felt backed into a corner for so long. I said the financial narrative was only part of it, that there were other issues, deeper ones, that had eaten away at my marriage from the inside. The judge nodded once and asked me to continue. My hands tightened around the edge of the table. I took a breath. But the air felt thick. Brent whispered that I could stop if I was not ready. I shook my head. I said that during the final year of my marriage I began noticing changes in how people around Julia spoke to her about me. That there were accusations whispered behind my back that she repeated to me as if they were confirmed truths. I said some of those accusations had caused one of the worst fights we ever had. The judge listened intently and asked if the accusations had ever been proven. I said no, because they were lies. Then he asked who made them. The room felt like it stopped breathing. I turned my head toward the one person who had never expected this day to come. The one person who had always assumed I would stay quiet the way I always had. I looked directly at Caleb. Before I said a word, I saw his face go pale. His hand lifted an inch as if he wanted to stop me from speaking. His eyes widened with panic. I took a slow breath, and I told the judge the truth. I told the judge that the accusation had come directly from Julia's brother. And the moment the words left my mouth, a wave of shock rippled across the courtroom. Chairs creaked. Someone in the gallery let out a quiet gasp. The judge held up his hand for silence. But the room was already slipping into a tense stillness. Caleb shook his head slowly, as if he could physically push my words back into my throat. His lips parted but no sound came out. Ronald turned toward him sharply, his jaw tightening, and Margaret's face drained of color. Julia stared at me with wide eyes, her breath catching in her chest, her hands trembling as she clutched the armrest. The judge asked me to clarify what accusation I was referring to. I swallowed hard, feeling the heat rise in my neck. I said that a year before the separation, I came home late from a project meeting to find Julia in tears. She confronted me about something she claimed I had done. Something vile and completely fabricated. She said her brother had told her he overheard me talking to a coworker about wanting a life without her and without our daughter. She believed it because she was already fragile, already stretched thin by constant pressure from her family. I said she had screamed at me that night, telling me I wanted to abandon our family. I said that no matter how much I denied it, she refused to listen. She chose to believe her brother, not me. The judge shifted his gaze toward Caleb. He asked him if he had made that claim. Caleb's voice cracked as he insisted he had never said anything like that. He said I was lying to cover up my own failures as a husband. He said I was twisting facts to paint myself as a victim. But the judge did not look convinced. He asked Caleb again. This time, more firmly. Caleb opened his mouth, closed it, then looked down at his hands. Ronald leaned in close to him, whispering sharply. Margaret gripped the back of his chair, her eyes darting between the judge and her son like she wanted to pull him out of the room. I took a breath and continued, saying that the situation went even further. I said that after the argument, I confronted Caleb directly, and he told me with a smirk that Julia deserved better than me. He told me that he had every right to protect his sister from a man like me, and that if it meant breaking our marriage, so be it. At that point, the Harrington lawyer jumped up, protesting loudly, insisting this was nonsense intended to distract from the financial arguments. The judge silenced him with a sharp instruction to sit. Then he asked me if I had any proof of that confrontation. I said no, because it had happened in their house, with no one else around. I said I had kept quiet because I thought exposing the conflict would only make my marriage worse. I said I had tried for months to rebuild trust. But the damage kept spreading, fed by whispers and assumptions. The judge leaned back, his face unreadable. He turned to Caleb again and asked him if he had anything he wanted to say. Caleb pressed a shaking hand to his forehead. When he finally looked up, his voice was thin and unsteady. He said he only ever acted in his sister's best interest. He said he thought I was taking advantage of her trust, that I was too consumed by my work to care about her needs. The judge asked him if that justified making up a lie. Caleb froze. You could see the moment his confidence broke. He stared at the judge, then at his parents. Margaret took a step back, her hand covering her mouth. Ronald sat stiffly, refusing to look at him. Caleb finally whispered that he had not meant for it to go that far. The judge's eyebrows rose. He asked him to repeat that. Caleb's voice grew quieter. He said he had only told Julia that I seemed distant, that she should be cautious, that maybe I was not as committed as she thought. He admitted he exaggerated some things, but he insisted he never meant to break the marriage. He kept saying he only wanted to protect her. He kept saying he did not think she would take it the way she did. Julia stood up so quickly her chair slid backward. Her breathing was fast and uneven. She stared at her brother with disbelief, her voice cracking as she asked him why he had done it. Caleb tried to speak, but his words stumbled. He said he thought she was making a mistake with me from the beginning. He said he thought she could do better. Julia took a step forward, tears filling her eyes. She looked devastated, like a piece of her reality had been pulled out from under her. She whispered that he had destroyed her marriage. Caleb tried to reach for her, but she backed away from him, shaking her head again and again. Margaret tried to intervene, but Julia snapped at her too, her voice breaking as she demanded to know why no one had ever told her the truth. Ronald stood up and grabbed her arm, telling her to sit down before she embarrassed the family further. She jerked her arm free, tears now streaming down her face. The judge rapped the gavel twice and demanded order. The Harrington lawyer scrambled to calm everyone, but the scene had already shattered the image of unity they were trying to project. Brent leaned toward me and whispered that this was the turning point. He said the judge now saw the dynamics clearly. He said that everything the Harringtons had built was starting to crack under their own weight. The judge took a breath and announced that, given the new information, the court would expand the scope of the hearing to include potential manipulation and undue influence in the marriage. He instructed both sides to prepare documentation and statements addressing the impact of family interference. The Harrington lawyer tried to object, but the judge dismissed him with a wave of his hand. He said the court had a responsibility to understand whether the divorce had been built on a foundation of coercion and falsehood. The air grew heavy again, but now it was charged with a different kind of tension, one sharper and more chaotic. Julia sat back down, her hands shaking violently. Caleb kept staring at the floor, refusing to look at her or at me. Ronald clenched his jaw so tightly that the muscles stood out along his face. Margaret stared fixedly at the judge, her expression hard as stone. The judge signaled for a short recess to allow everyone to regain composure. I stood up slowly, my legs stiff, my mind spinning with everything that had just happened. I could feel eyes on me from every direction. Reporters, spectators, attorneys, but I ignored them all. My focus was on the door leading out of the courtroom and the hallway beyond it. I needed air. I needed distance. I needed a second to process how quickly everything had unraveled. As I stepped out into the hallway, Brent followed and placed a hand on my shoulder. He told me this was going better than anything he had expected. But he warned me it was far from over. He said the worst storms look calm before they break. I nodded, trying to steady my breathing. Then, just as I began to regain my balance, I heard hurried footsteps behind me, someone calling my name. I turned and saw Julia walking toward me, tears streaking her cheeks, her expression lost and pleading. She asked if we could talk, and everything inside me tightened again. I told her we could talk, but only somewhere quiet. She nodded quickly, almost desperately, and followed me down the hallway toward a small alcove near the elevators where only a vending machine hummed in the corner. The noise of the courtroom faded behind us, replaced by the sterile quiet of the courthouse corridor. She stopped a few feet away from me, wiping at her face with her sleeve, breathing unevenly. For a long moment she did not speak. She just looked at me with this mixture of regret, fear, and something else I could not quite read. Maybe shame, maybe disbelief at how quickly the truth had caught up with her family. I waited, hands in my pockets, steadying myself. I did not trust whatever she was about to say, and I did not trust what it might ignite inside me either. She finally spoke in a quiet, strained voice. She said she had no idea her brother had twisted anything that way. She said she always assumed he had heard something real because he would never lie to her. She shook her head slowly, whispering that she never imagined he would go that far. I told her calmly that what she imagined or did not imagine was not the point. The point was she believed everyone except the person she married. She looked away, biting her lip hard as if trying to keep herself from breaking down again. She said she was sorry, over and over. She said she never meant for any of this to happen. She said she wished she had questioned things sooner, that she wished she had looked at me the way she used to, instead of seeing me through her family's eyes. I listened, but I kept my expression unreadable. Her words were soft and painful, but they did not erase the months of distance, the cold looks, the accusations she had thrown at me without hesitation. They did not erase the nights I slept alone while she stayed at her parents' house. They did not erase the moments I felt like I was a stranger inside my own marriage. She said she wanted to know if things could have been different, if we had actually talked before everything fell apart, if there was a version of us that might have survived. I told her I did try to talk, many times. I reminded her how often I asked her what was wrong, how many times I tried to understand the distance she kept creating, how many times I tried to pull us back to the same page. Every time she turned away, every time she listened more to her brother or her mother than to me. She chipped a little more off the foundation until there was nothing left to stand on. She let out a shaky breath and leaned against the wall, covering her mouth with her hand. She whispered that she felt stupid for believing everything she was told, that she let pressure shape her decisions, that she had been afraid of disappointing her parents more than losing me. I stared at her for a long moment and told her the truth. I said that fear did not excuse what she did, and it did not excuse letting other people dictate her thoughts. I said I had been alone in that marriage long before she ever filed for divorce. She flinched, then nodded slowly, her shoulders sagging. She said she understood if I hated her. She said she did not expect forgiveness. She said she just needed to say the words before she lost any chance of being honest. I did not tell her I hated her. I did not tell her I forgave her either. I told her what I felt, which was something heavier than anger and colder than sorrow. I told her I believed she was sorry, but I also believed she had waited too long to say it. For a while, neither of us spoke. The hum of the vending machine filled the silence. People passed by, glancing briefly before moving on. The courthouse felt like a place suspended between endings and consequences. She finally lifted her eyes toward me and asked if there was anything she could do to fix at least part of the damage. She said she wanted to help make things right in the custody hearing, that she wanted the truth to come out clearly, not twisted the way her family always twisted things. I told her that was not something she could repair with a few sentences in the hallway. The judge would weigh the evidence, not her regrets. She nodded again. Accepting that, she stepped closer then, cautiously, like she was afraid I might step away. She whispered that she missed what we used to be. She whispered that she never stopped caring. That part made me look away. Hearing it felt like someone opening a door I had already sealed shut. Before I could say anything else, Brent appeared at the end of the hallway. He stayed several steps back, giving us space but watching closely. He cleared his throat gently to let me know the recess was ending soon. Julia wiped her eyes again and asked if she could say one more thing. I nodded once. She said she hoped that whatever happened next, I would remember the good years we had. Not just how it ended. She said she knew she had ruined a lot. Maybe everything. But she would spend the rest of her life hoping she could at least salvage some piece of honesty from the wreckage. I told her softly that I remembered everything. Not only the good or the bad. All of it. I said the problem was that the part she destroyed was the part that used to make us real. She closed her eyes, let out a trembling breath, and nodded without trying to argue. Brent approached then and told us we needed to head back inside. Julia stepped back, squared her shoulders, and inhaled deeply as if bracing for impact. I walked ahead of her, feeling the weight of her presence behind me but not letting it pull me off balance. When we returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere felt different, colder, sharper. The Harringtons looked fractured, unable to present a united front anymore. Ronald glared at me with pure contempt. But his anger lacked its usual confidence. Margaret sat rigidly, her face pale and drawn. Caleb refused to lift his head at all. The judge entered again and called the court to order. Brent leaned in and whispered that the next part of the hearing would focus on intent, influence, and credibility. He said the truth about the financials and Caleb's manipulation had already opened the door. But what came next would either close the case in our favor or blow the entire situation wider than we expected. I straightened my back and tried to steady my breathing. Then the judge began the next round of questioning. And within minutes, everything shifted again as he asked the one question none of us were prepared for. He wanted to know what else I had been holding back. The question cut deeper than anything he had asked so far. For a second I just stared at him, feeling the weight of months settle on my chest. There is a difference between hiding something out of fear and holding it back for the right moment. Sitting there, under the lights of that courtroom, I knew I had run out of places to hide. Brent shifted beside me. I could feel him look at me, feel the warning in his silence. We had talked about strategy, about timing, about what to reveal and when, but there was a part of this that I had kept even from him. Not because I did not trust him, but because saying it out loud made it too real. The judge waited. He did not press. He did not lean on the question. He just let it sit there between us. That somehow made it heavier. I took a slow breath and told him there was something else. Yes. Not about my finances. Not about my marriage. Something about the Harrington family itself. The reaction behind me was immediate. I heard chairs creak. I could feel Ronald straighten. feel the heat of his attention on the back of my neck. The Harrington lawyer stood halfway up before thinking better of it and sinking back down. The judge asked me to explain what I meant. His voice stayed calm, but his eyes sharpened. I said that, after Julia and I separated, there was a day when I went back to the house in Bellevue to pick up documents for Lily. School forms, medical records, things CPS had asked for. Julia had agreed to let me in while she was at work. The house had felt even bigger and emptier than usual. Like a hotel after the guests had checked out, but the staff had not turned off the lights. I described how I walked past the family photos, past the grand staircase, past the rows of framed awards that covered the hallway, how I remembered the first time I had been brought there, feeling completely out of place in a world that measured worth in square footage and stock prices. That day, walking through as a man in the middle of a divorce, I felt something different. I felt free enough to see things clearly. I went into Julia's home office because that was where she kept the filing cabinet with Lily's records. I found the school folder quickly. I found the pediatrician paperwork. I was about to leave when I noticed the light still on in the corner. A small blue glow from the scanner on her desk. I had always known that scanner was hooked to a shared folder on her computer. She scanned contracts for work, personal documents, anything she did not want to keep, only in paper form. That day, the screen was still active, showing a list of recently scanned files. A stack of papers sat next to it. I told the judge I had not intended to snoop. At first, all I wanted was to shut the equipment down and leave. But the file names caught my eye. They were not labeled like personal documents. They had codes, strings of letters and numbers, and the name Harrington Realty tucked into the margins. Something in me hesitated. Then curiosity pushed. I clicked. Brent listened with his jaw tight. He knew parts of this story now, but not the way I was telling it. With every detail laid bare in front of a judge, I told the court what I saw on that screen. Internal ledgers that did not match the public reports. Transfer records moving large amounts of money through shell companies with addresses in places no normal family should be sending money to. Wire instructions that looped through 3 different banks before landing in accounts listed under trusts and obscure entities. I remembered the cold feeling in my stomach when I realized what I was looking at. It was not just aggressive accounting or creative tax work. It was laundering. It was money that came out one color and went back in another. The judge asked how I knew that. I said I had spent enough years building a technology company, dealing with investors, reading financial statements, to know what legitimate capital flows should look like. And these were not that. I told him I did not take any physical documents. I did not break into anything. I simply opened the folder that was sitting there on the screen and used my phone to take pictures of what I saw. Page after page. Every ledger. Every contract. Every signature that tied those numbers back to Ronald and Margaret and their company. I could feel Ronald glaring at me. In my mind, I saw his signature at the bottom of one of those pages. It had looked so confident, so permanent. When I saw it on the screen, the judge asked when this happened. I told him it was several months before the divorce filing, when the marriage was already hanging by a thread, but before lawyers got involved. I said I had kept the images on a drive, locked away. At first, I did not know what to do with them. I was angry. But I also knew what accusing a wealthy, connected family of financial crime could do to my own life if I did it without proof. I explained that after the startup sale closed, after the money hit my account, and I knew I no longer depended on anything from the Harrington orbit, I met with Brent and showed him a portion of what I had found. Not all. Enough to know it was real. Brent had contacts. People who understood corporate fraud better than either of us. Quietly. A former forensic accountant looked over anonymized copies and confirmed what I already suspected. The numbers were not just sloppy. They were deliberate. The judge listened, without interrupting. He asked if any law enforcement agency had been contacted yet. I told him no. I said I had waited because I knew the moment I handed this over, it would stop being just my divorce case and become something much larger. I said I did not want to weaponize criminal accusations as leverage in a custody battle. Even if the people involved had done everything they could to weaponize their power against me. That part was important. I needed him to understand that this was not some stunt. This was me finally refusing to carry the weight of their secrets. Brent stood and added that he had reviewed the material and believed it was serious enough to require independent investigation. He made it clear that we were not asking the family court to rule on those crimes, only to recognize that they existed and that they spoke to the character and credibility of the people trying to strip me of my daughter. The Harrington lawyer exploded then. He called it a smear. He said it was slander designed to destroy a respected business and a respected family. He pointed at me, his voice rising, saying I was vindictive, that I was trying to burn down everything because my pride was hurt. The judge shut him down abruptly. His voice cut through the noise. Calmly but firmly, he said that if even a fraction of what I had described was accurate, it could not be ignored. He reminded everyone that the courtroom was not a place to bury serious allegations under technicalities and outrage. It was a place to surface the truth, wherever it led. He then asked if I still had the original files. My throat felt dry. I said yes. Brent reached into his briefcase and pulled out a second folder that had stayed closed until that moment. It was thicker than the one that held my personal financials. Red tabs marked sections throughout it. When he set it on the evidence table, the sound echoed in the quiet room. The judge signaled for the clerk to bring it to him. He opened it, adjusted his glasses, and began to read. For a long moment there was no sound but the rustle of paper and the distant rumble of rain outside. Ronald sat rigid, his fists clenched. Margaret stared straight ahead, her face drained. Julia closed her eyes briefly, as if bracing for impact. Caleb looked like he might be sick. The judge turned pages slowly, his expression growing more and more serious. When he finally looked up, there was no trace of the mild amusement he had shown earlier at the news of my startup sale. This was something else entirely. He said that based on what he had just seen, the court could not, in good conscience, proceed as if this were an ordinary civil dispute. There were potential federal crimes suggested by the documents in his hand. He stated clearly that he was obligated to refer the matter to the proper authorities. The Harrington lawyer tried to argue again, saying the documents were stolen, saying the chain of custody was unclear. The judge cut him off, saying those questions would be for another courtroom at another time. For now, his duty was to ensure the information reached agencies equipped to investigate it. He announced that all civil proceedings relating to property and spousal support would be paused until law enforcement had an opportunity to review the material. Matters concerning custody, he said, would remain under his consideration. But there was no way to ignore what the documents implied about the environment my daughter had been living around. I sat there, heart pounding, while the reality of what I had just set in motion settled over the room. I had always known that envelope could change everything. I had imagined this moment in a dozen different ways. At 2 a.m, staring at the ceiling of a cheap apartment, or alone in my parked car gripping the steering wheel until my hands hurt. But nothing compared to watching a judge look at Ronald and Margaret Harrington and tell them, calmly and without anger, that their empire might soon be under criminal investigation. The clerk gathered the folder, now marked for transfer. The judge made a note for the record, his pen moving steadily across the page. Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside, a different kind of storm had finally begun. The room stayed silent for several seconds after the judge finished speaking, as if everyone needed time to understand the magnitude of what had just happened. Even the steady patter of rain outside seemed distant. I sat there, barely breathing, watching the clerk carry the red-tabbed folder to the judge's assistant, who would prepare it for transfer to federal investigators. The reality of it hit me slowly, not as triumph, but as the kind of cold clarity that sinks into your bones. Ronald's chair creaked sharply as he stood, ignoring the judge's warning. "Look." His voice came out low and shaking, telling the court that this was a mistake, that none of this meant anything, that family businesses handled finances differently, and outsiders never understood. The judge cut him off before he could get farther, telling him to sit and reminding him again that arguments about guilt or innocence belonged elsewhere. Margaret placed a hand on Ronald's arm, as if she feared he might say something even more damaging. Her face stayed pale and rigid, the kind of expression people wear when their world cracks, but they refuse to acknowledge it. Julia looked at me across the room. Her eyes were glassy, full of fear and sadness, and maybe a kind of regret I did not know how to respond to anymore. Caleb kept staring at the floor, shoulders hunched and unmoving, as if hoping he could disappear into the tile. Brent leaned slightly toward me and whispered that this hearing was about to take a sharp turn. He said the judge had just placed a spotlight on everything the Harringtons had tried so hard to keep buried. And now the question would be how that truth affected custody. The judge cleared his throat and asked everyone to take their seats. Once he had their full attention, he stated that because the scope of the case had changed, he would review the existing custody arguments under a new lens. He said that the financial environment surrounding the child was relevant, especially if the household she spent time in might become the focus of criminal proceedings. That last line struck the Harringtons harder than any accusation of fraud. The judge instructed both legal teams to prepare for a focused custody review. He invited Brent to present first. Brent stood calmly, straightened his jacket, and walked to the center of the courtroom. He spoke plainly. He explained that I had been the consistent caregiver, that every school drop-off and pick-up, every pediatric appointment, every night Lily had trouble sleeping, it was me. He emphasized that during the months leading to the separation, it was my apartment that had stability, structure, routines, meals, books before bedtime. He said that my actions spoke louder than any claim the Harringtons had tried to make. He also pointed out something I had never said aloud myself, that while Julia's parents had always demanded respect, they had never once behaved respectfully toward me in front of Lily. And that mattered. Ronald shifted again at that, but stayed seated this time. Margaret whispered angrily into his ear. Brent continued, describing the environment Lily would be exposed to if she continued spending time in the Harrington home. Not only the hostility toward me, her father, but now the looming pressure of an investigation. He ended simply, saying that the best interests of the child were clear. When the judge nodded toward the Harrington lawyer, the man walked forward but with much less confidence than earlier. His voice lacked its usual booming authority. He stumbled through statements about tradition, stability, family bonds. He claimed Julia's parents could provide a household with financial resources and emotional support. But the judge interrupted him, asking if he meant the same parents who were now connected to a potential federal investigation. The lawyer froze for a moment, flustered, then tried to argue that nothing had been proven yet. But the momentum was already against him. Julia was called next. She stepped toward the stand slowly, her eyes downcast. She answered questions about Lily's routines, about which parent handled what, about her own time at work, about the nights she had missed because she stayed at her parents' house. Her voice stayed soft and strained. Then the judge asked her directly which home she believed offered more consistency for Lily right now. She hesitated. Her mouth opened, then closed. She took a trembling breath and finally whispered that she believed I could provide more stability. She added that the situation at her parents' house was too unpredictable now. Her parents stared at her like she had betrayed them in front of the world. Margaret shook her head slowly, eyes wide with disbelief. Ronald's nostrils flared, his jaw clenching as if he might explode. Julia wiped her tears and continued in a quiet voice, saying she did not want Lily anywhere near a situation that could escalate into something dangerous or public. She said she trusted me, despite everything, and that Lily needed someone steady. When she was dismissed, she walked back to her seat and sat without looking at her family. Caleb stared at her in shock. Brent gathered his papers. I steadied myself. The judge sat back and looked at both sides with a stern expression. He said he had heard enough to form a preliminary conclusion. Before he could finish, Ronald shot out of his seat again. He accused me of manipulating Julia, of planting fear, of orchestrating this entire situation. He said I was trying to destroy them and take his granddaughter away. His voice kept rising, each word sharper than the last. The judge slammed his gavel and threatened to remove him if he did not sit immediately. Ronald obeyed, but barely. The judge continued, stating that his role was not to reward one side or punish another, but to make sure a child was shielded from instability. He said he needed clarity from me before he finalized his decision. Then he turned his attention fully to me. He asked me to explain what kind of future I envisioned for my daughter if primary custody was granted. He said he wanted to understand not only my capacity as a parent, but my long-term intentions. For a moment I was caught off guard. I had expected legal questions, not something this personal. I felt Brent tense beside me, as if preparing to speak for me. But I lifted a hand lightly and told him I would answer. I stood and took a breath. I described the condo in South Lake Union I had purchased after the sale of the startup. I told him about the small backyard Lily loved to run in, the little desk where she drew pictures and practiced letters, the quiet street where she liked to ride her bike. I told him about my flexible work schedule, how my new company allowed me to choose my hours, how I had already hired a manager to handle most day-to-day operations so I could be there when Lily needed me. I told him I wanted her to grow up safe, to have a home where no one raised their voice at her or tried to twist her world for the sake of pride. I said I wanted her to learn kindness, responsibility, integrity, not the kind of cold ambition that crushed everything in its path. I finished by telling him that Lily was not a bargaining chip or a trophy. She was my daughter, and all I wanted was to give her a life full of security and warmth. When I sat down, the courtroom stayed silent. The judge folded his hands, took a long breath, and signaled that he was ready to announce his decision. But before he could open his mouth, the side door of the courtroom swung open. A deputy marshal stepped inside, walked briskly to the judge, and handed him a sealed envelope. The judge looked down at it, eyebrows lifting in mild surprise, then broke the seal and skimmed the contents. His expression changed, slowly, unmistakably. He set the paper down, leaned back, and looked at the Harrington family with a gaze colder than anything we had seen all day. He said there had been a development, and that everything in this courtroom just shifted again. He looked at the Harringtons, then down at the paper again, then back to them, and I knew whatever was in that envelope did not come from this courthouse. He said that while we had been in session, federal authorities had executed search warrants on several properties and offices connected to Harrington Realty Group, headquarters in downtown Seattle, the Bellevue office, and the Harrington residence had all been visited by agents that morning. He said the document in his hand was confirmation that the material submitted in my folder had triggered immediate action at the federal level. For a second, nobody moved. Then the room fractured. Ronald lurched to his feet again, shouting that this was impossible, that nobody had the right to raid his company. The judge warned him once more to sit or be removed. Margaret pressed her hand to her chest and looked like she might faint. Julia's shoulders dropped, and she stared at the floor as if she had run out of strength to react. Caleb sank even deeper into his chair. Color completely drained from his face. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. But my body was oddly still. I had known this might happen quickly once the file landed in the right hands. But hearing it spoken aloud by a judge made it feel real in a way that months of planning never had. The judge waited until the noise settled. Then he said something that put a hard period at the end of that long chapter of my life. He granted me primary physical custody of Lily, with Julia granted visitation that would be structured once the criminal investigation clarified her position. He stated that the environment in my home was clearly more stable than the one currently forming around the Harringtons, and that Lily's safety and emotional well-being had to come before family pride or wealth. He did not look at Ronald when he said that last part. But he did not need to. The meaning was clear. When he finished reading the order, I felt my legs almost give out. I had not realized how tightly I had been gripping the armrests until I looked down and saw the white imprint on my knuckles. Brent squeezed my shoulder and whispered, "Congratulations." But his tone was gentle, not triumphant. He knew this was not about winning. It was about surviving. Court adjourned. The gavel came down. People stood and began to move in a blur of movement and low voices. I stayed seated for a moment, letting the reality sink in. I had custody of my daughter. Federal agents were walking through the glass lobby of the Harrington building at that very moment. The file I carried into this courtroom had just rearranged the future for an entire family. When I finally stood and turned, Ronald was staring at me. There was no smugness left. No towering arrogance. Just raw hatred and something else. Something like disbelief that a man he had always dismissed as a nobody had managed to pull the one thread that unraveled everything. Margaret refused to look at me. She kept her eyes fixed on the door, her hand clamped around her purse. Julia glanced up briefly. Our eyes met for half a second. There was too much in that look to unpack in a hallway. Too much history and damage, and what if? Then she turned away to speak to her lawyer about whatever came next for her. Caleb did not lift his head at all. Brent guided me out of the courtroom. Reporters were already gathering in the hallway. Phones and cameras raised. We moved past them with quick steps. Brent spoke for me when someone shouted a question. He said we had no comment at this time. That phrase felt small next to the storm brewing outside those walls. In the weeks that followed, I watched the news in short bursts. Never for too long. I saw the footage of agents carrying boxes out of Harrington Realty's headquarters. I saw the headlines about frozen accounts. I halted projects. Investors filing suits. I saw Ronald being escorted into a black SUV outside a federal building, trying to hold himself like a chairman and not a defendant. I saw Margaret walk into court for her arraignment, lips pressed into a thin line. I read about the internal emails investigators had seized, about offshore accounts, about fake consulting contracts that moved money in circles until nobody could follow it without a map. Caleb vanished from the public eye. Rumors floated around about him leaving the country and then being forced back by the investigation. Eventually, his name appeared in a small paragraph about additional charges being considered against senior executives and family members involved in company finances. Julia's name appeared later, in connection with maintaining internal ledgers and signing certain documents. The articles said she was cooperating. I was not surprised. She had always lived in the shadow of her parents' expectations. But she had never been as reckless as them. Federal trials move slowly, and the one against the Harringtons took the better part of a year to unfold. I sat in the back for only a handful of days. Enough to hear the indictments. Enough to watch Ronald listen while a prosecutor walked through spreadsheets and wire transfers. Enough to see Margaret flinch when her signature showed up on a projected document. Ronald was sentenced to 15 years for fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. Margaret received 7 years for her role in moving and disguising funds. Caleb faced additional proceedings for misusing corporate accounts and ended up with his own set of charges. Julia, because she cooperated and because her role was smaller, received a sentence of a little more than 2 years for helping conceal records. The empire that had once seemed untouchable dissolved piece by piece. Harrington Realty Group declared bankruptcy. Properties were seized or sold off to pay creditors and fines. The beautiful house in Bellevue, the one where I had first walked in holding flowers and hope, eventually went on the market under a court-ordered sale. I drove past it once. Just once. The manicured lawn was rougher. The gate slightly rusted. The windows dark. It looked less like a symbol of success and more like a shell. By then, life for me and Lily had taken on a quieter shape. We moved into a small house north of Seattle, close to a lake with a walking trail that Lily loved. I kept the condo as an investment and chose the lake house for us because it felt like somewhere you could actually breathe. Mornings were simple. Cereal. Backpacks. A drive to school. Evenings were homework at the kitchen table. Dinner together. A story before bed. Vector Path had long since been acquired, and the money from that gave us the cushion I had never had growing up. With that security, I started a new company, smaller and more focused, building tools for local businesses instead of chasing the next big tech wave. I set it up so that my schedule revolved around my daughter, not the other way around. My parents moved into a comfortable place in Tacoma that I bought in their names. For the first time, they had a yard of their own and a garage that did not leak when it rained. On weekends, Lily and I drove down to visit. We ate my mom's cooking at a real table instead of the folding thing they used to keep in the corner of their old rental. My dad would clap me on the shoulder when he thought I was not looking. The way men of his generation say they are proud, without putting it into words. Lily adjusted faster than I did in some ways. Kids are like that. Resilient in ways we forget we used to be. She asked about her mom often at first. We talked about visits and phone calls and letters. I kept it honest without pouring the weight of our adult choices onto her small shoulders. When Julia was sent to a federal facility, I did not take Lily to see her. Not right away. I wanted Julia to stabilize, to understand where she was and why. Eventually, when Lily was older and asked more directly, we had the conversation. I told her that sometimes adults make terrible decisions and have to face you cannot escape that without consequences. I told her her mother still loved her. That part was true. Whatever else had happened, I visited Julia once on my own. The facility was a couple of hours away. I drove there with the windows cracked and the radio low. My mind going in circles around things I had already dissected 100 times. What I would say. What I would not say. What I needed to let go of, and what I never would. She looked smaller in that visiting room. In the neutral clothing they gave her. Hair pulled back. No makeup. No tailored suits. No polished image, just a woman who had lost almost everything chasing a life built on someone else's rules. We talked quietly. She said she had heard about the sentencing. She said she knew her father blamed me for everything. And maybe always would. Even from behind bars. She said it was easier for him than admitting he had done it to himself. She asked about Lily. I told her our daughter was doing well. That she was learning to read faster than kids her age, that she liked drawing lakes and mountains and rockets, that she still kept a picture of her mother on her nightstand. Julia cried then. Silently. Hands flat on the table. She apologized again. Not just for the lies and the coldness and the choices, but for not seeing what her family really was until it was too late. I listened. I believed she meant it. But forgiveness is not a switch you flip because someone says sorry. It is a process. And most of that process happens alone. Before I left, I told her I did not wake up hating her. that I woke up focused on Lily. On work. On building a life that was not defined by what the Harringtons had done. I told her I hoped that when she got out, she would choose something different than what had been handed to her. She nodded and said she would try. I walked out of that building feeling lighter than I expected. Not happy. Not relieved in some dramatic way. Just lighter. Like I had put down the last piece of a weight I had been carrying for far too long. These days, when I stand on the back deck of our house and watch Lily throw a stick for the neighbor's dog by the water, my thoughts are quieter. I still remember the courtroom, the rain on the windows, the envelope in my hand, the look on Ronald's face when he realized he no longer controlled the story. I remember nights in that cheap apartment in North Seattle, wondering if any of this would ever tilt in my favor. But mostly I remember the mornings now. The sound of a small voice asking, "What is for breakfast?" The sight of a backpack left in the hallway even though I have told her 1,000 times to hang it up. The feeling of her hand in mine when we cross the parking lot at the grocery store. People talk a lot about revenge like it is a destination. For me, it ended up being something different. Justice mattered. Exposing what they had done mattered. Protecting my daughter mattered most of all. In the end, the real victory was not watching them fall. It was walking away from the wreckage with my integrity and my child's future intact. If you have listened to all of this, I want to ask you something. If you were sitting where I sat, watching the people who tried to ruin you lose everything in front of a judge, would you feel satisfied? Or would you still be carrying anger? Would you have stayed quiet to keep the peace? Or would you have done what I did and pulled that file out anyway? Tell me what you think. Tell me what part of this story hit you the hardest. And if you want to hear more stories like this, more about people finding a way to stand up when everything is stacked against them, stick around and let me know.